June 18, 1945, 10:15 in the morning. A coral ridge overlooking the Mezado Valley on Okinawa, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., stood between two limestone boulders, binoculars pressed to his weathered face, watching the 8th Marine Regiment advance across open ground below. The operation was proceeding according to plan. Japanese resistance was crumbling. The battle was won, or nearly so. "Just a few more days," he murmured to his aide, lowering the field glasses. "We're almost through." What Buckner didn't know was that the mathematics of command, the cold calculus of acceptable risk, and the bitter irony of timing would converge in the next 47 seconds to create the most symbolically devastating loss of the entire Second World War. The shell that killed him traveled approximately 1,200 yards. Japanese gunners, hidden in a cave system the Americans had bypassed in their final push, had spent the morning ranging their 47mm gun on possible observation posts. They couldn't see their targets clearly. They were firing at likely positions, at predictable spots where American commanders might stand to watch their victory unfold. The 6th round of their morning harassment fire struck the coral boulder to Buckner's right at precisely 10:15 and 43 seconds. Fragments of shell casing and pulverized coral moved at supersonic speed through the narrow gap between the rocks. Buckner was struck in the chest and abdomen. He died within 10 minutes, never regaining consciousness, the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy action in the entire war. The scale of irony was staggering. After 3 months of the bloodiest fighting in the Pacific, after 82 days of combat that cost 12,520 American lives, and over 100,000 Japanese military and civilian dead, after Buckner had successfully commanded the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific campaign, after organized resistance had effectively ended and staff officers were already drafting victory announcements, a random artillery shell fired by a desperate defeated enemy killed the man who had orchestrated it all. The battle was over. The island was taken. The war itself would end in less than 2 months. And the general died watching mop-up operations, standing in a spot his own doctrine would have forbidden junior officers to occupy, killed by a threat so minimal his security detail had judged it acceptable. June 18, 1945, was supposed to be a day of observation, not combat. The 10th Army's after-action reports would later describe organized Japanese resistance as having effectively ceased by June 16th. Buckner had come forward not to direct tactical operations, but to witness the culmination of his campaign, to see the 8th Marines, fresh to the island and eager to prove themselves after arriving too late for the heaviest fighting, finally get their chance at combat. He was, in the assessment of multiple witnesses, relaxed. He was confident. He was already thinking about the occupation phase, about reconstruction, about the next operation. Colonel Arthur Wharton, standing 12 feet away, would later testify that Buckner had been discussing post-battle administrative matters moments before the shell struck. The general was no longer fighting a war, he was managing a victory. Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. had spent his entire life preparing for command. Born on July 18, 1886, to a Confederate general who had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant during the Civil War, he carried his father's name and legacy like a weight he was determined to redeem through service to the reunified nation. His father's surrender at Fort Donelson had been one of the Confederacy's first major defeats. The younger Buckner would spend 57 years in uniform, determined that if he ever faced a similar moment, he would do so having exhausted every option, having spent every resource, having left nothing on the field. He graduated from West Point in 1908, served in the Philippines twice, fought in the First World War, and spent decades as one of the Army's most demanding instructors, teaching at West Point and the War College, earning a reputation for uncompromising standards and tactical brilliance. By 1941, when the war found him in command of the Alaska Defense Command, he was considered one of the Army's most capable senior officers. The Pacific War had given Buckner his chance to prove what he had spent a lifetime learning. In Alaska, he had overseen the defense against the Japanese attack on the Aleutian Islands in June 1942. One of only 2 times Japanese forces occupied American territory during the war. He had then directed the American counteroffensive in May 1943, that retook Atta Island in brutal fighting across frozen mountainous terrain. The campaign had been costly, the conditions nearly impossible, but Buckner's planning and determination had prevailed. In July 1944, he was transferred to Hawaii to command the newly organized 10th Army, initially formed for an invasion of Taiwan that would never occur. Instead, in April 1945, he led the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific Theater, landing 182,000 troops on Okinawa in an assault that made Normandy look small by comparison. The island was 340 miles from the Japanese home islands. Its capture would provide the staging area for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan itself. Buckner's approach to Okinawa reflected everything he had learned and taught over nearly 4 decades of service. He was methodical, he was thorough, he believed in overwhelming force properly applied, in careful preparation, in accepting no unnecessary risks with his men's lives. His doctrine emphasized systematic advance, heavy artillery preparation, and the complete destruction of enemy positions before infantry moved forward. Critics called him slow. Supporters called him careful. The casualty figures, he believed, would vindicate his methods. Better to take time than to take losses. Better to advance slowly than to send men into killing zones. Better to let firepower do the work than to spend lives achieving the same objective. This was the doctrine he had taught at West Point, the principle he had applied in the Aleutians, the strategy he brought to Okinawa. The Marines under his command had chafed at his caution. Marine Corps doctrine emphasized aggressive maneuver, rapid advance, accepting tactical risks to achieve operational tempo. Buckner's Army methodicalness frustrated Marine commanders who believed opportunities were being missed, that Japanese forces could be destroyed more quickly through envelopment and aggressive pursuit. Major General Roy Geiger of the 3rd Amphibious Corps had proposed multiple times that Marine divisions execute an amphibious end run around Japanese positions, landing behind enemy lines to accelerate the campaign. Each time, Buckner had refused. The terrain was wrong, the logistics were insufficient, the risk was unacceptable. The systematic approach would prevail. Time was on their side. American firepower would grind down Japanese resistance. Patience would minimize casualties. This was his judgment as commanding general, and he would not waver from it. By early June, the systematic approach had succeeded. The 10th Army had pushed Japanese forces into the southern tip of the island. The 32nd Japanese Army, which had begun the campaign with approximately 70,000 combat troops, was shattered. American forces had captured the Shuri Line, the main Japanese defensive position, on May 31st. By June 4th, organized Japanese resistance was crumbling. By June 16th, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, senior staff officer of the 32nd Army, was writing in his diary that continued resistance was pointless, that the battle was lost, that the only question was how many more would die before the inevitable end. By June 18th, when Buckner climbed that ridge to observe the 8th Marines' first operation, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The general was watching not a battle, but a conclusion. What Buckner saw through his binoculars that morning was a landscape of devastation and transformation. Okinawa had been before the invasion a relatively prosperous agricultural island, its southern portion covered with villages, farms, and terraced hillsides. 3 months of combat had turned it into a moonscape. Artillery had fired over 2,700,000 rounds. Naval gunfire had added millions more. Airstrikes had dropped thousands of tons of bombs and napalm. Every natural feature had been transformed into a fortification or destroyed, attempting to reduce one. Villages existed only as scorched foundations. Forests had been reduced to splintered stumps. The very contours of the land had changed. Hills lowered by bombardment, valleys filled with rubble, and everywhere the dead. American burial details will still find bodies weeks after areas had been declared secure. Japanese dead numbered in the tens of thousands, many sealed in the caves and tunnels that honeycombed the island's limestone geology. Civilian casualties were estimated at 40,000 to 150,000, a number so uncertain because entire communities had vanished into the chaos of combat. The cost had been staggering even by Pacific War standards. 12,520 Americans killed in action or dead of wounds, 36,531 wounded, Another 26,000 psychiatric casualties, men broken by the intensity and duration of combat that never seemed to end. Some units had suffered casualty rates exceeding 100%, requiring complete replacement twice over during the campaign. The 1st Marine Division veterans of Guadalcanal and Peleliu fought on Okinawa for 90 days and suffered casualties approaching 50%. The 96th Infantry Division lost 7,691 men killed or wounded. The suicide boat attacks, the kamikaze strikes, the cave-by-cave fighting had created a level of sustained intensity unlike anything American forces had previously experienced. And Buckner had commanded through all of it, making the decisions about where to commit reserves, when to pause for reorganization, how fast to push the advance. The first revelation came not from the ridge where Buckner died, but from a cave system discovered 3 days earlier by soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division. Captain James Phelps, a 32-year-old intelligence officer from Sacramento, California, had entered the caves expecting to find ammunition stores or perhaps a small field hospital. What he found instead was the headquarters of the 32nd Japanese Army, abandoned so recently that papers were still scattered across desks, rice was still warm in bowls, and oil lamps were still burning. "I couldn't believe they'd left everything," Phelps later testified. Maps with our positions marked in red, complete order of battle documents, casualty reports going back to April 1st, staff journals with daily entries. It was like they'd just stood up and walked away, leaving their entire war behind them. Among the documents was the personal diary of Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding general of the 32nd Army. Phelps, who spoke enough Japanese to recognize the significance of what he was reading, sat on the cave floor and worked through the final entries by lamplight. June 14th. Resistance cannot continue much longer. Ammunition nearly exhausted, food supplies critical, must consider how to end this with honor. June 5th. Received reports that American forces have broken through final defensive line. Yahara advises immediate surrender. I cannot order this. We will resist until strength is completely spent. June 6th. American artillery fire continuous. Cannot communicate with most units. Believe many positions have been destroyed or abandoned. Do not know how many men still resist. Will remain at this position until enemy arrives or until honorable death releases me from duty. Captain Phelps read these words and experienced a moment of cognitive dissonance so powerful he later described it as physically nauseating. For 3 months, American forces had been fighting what seemed like endless resistance. Every ridge concealed bunkers. Every cave held defenders. Every advance was contested with suicidal intensity. The Japanese had seemed inexhaustible, fanatical, willing to fight forever. We thought they'd never quit, Phelps said in a post-war interview. Every position we took, there was another one behind it. Every time we thought we'd broken through, there was another defensive line. And here's their commanding general 4 days earlier say they're finished, they've got nothing left, they can't continue. If he knew it was over on June 14th, why were we still fighting on June 18th? How many men died in those 4 days because nobody told them the war was already lost? The pattern Phelps discovered in that cave extended across the entire southern battlefield. As intelligence officers examined the captured documents over the following days, a picture emerged of an army that had ceased to function as an organized force days or even weeks before American intelligence had recognized it. Supply records showed that Japanese units had received no food deliveries after June 1st. Ammunition reports indicated that most artillery pieces had fewer than 5 rounds remaining by June 10th. Medical records documented that the Japanese field hospitals had run out of antibiotics, anesthetics, and surgical supplies by early June, leaving thousands of wounded men to die of infections, or simply from their wounds, without any treatment at all. Communication logs showed that the 32nd Army headquarters had lost contact with most subordinate units by June 12th and had been unable to issue coherent orders or coordinate defensive actions for nearly a week before abandoning the headquarters cave. Master Sergeant Robert Chen, a 29-year-old translator from San Francisco, spent 2 weeks after the battle's end reviewing captured documents and interviewing Japanese prisoners. What he discovered was a collapse so complete and so recent that it had occurred while American forces were still treating their enemy as a coherent fighting force. By June 10th, Chen wrote in his intelligence summary, the 32nd Army had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning military organization. What remained were isolated pockets of troops, most cut off from command, many without officers, some without any idea that their headquarters had been destroyed, or that their commanding officers were dead or had committed suicide. They were fighting not because they had orders or a plan or any hope of success. They were fighting because they didn't know how to stop, because surrender was culturally impossible, because they had nowhere to go even if they wanted to quit. We were fighting an organizational corpse that was still twitching. The scale became clear when analysts compiled the timeline. The Shuri line, the main Japanese defensive position, had fallen on May 31st. General Ushijima's diary entries from June 1st showed he recognized the position as hopeless and that continued resistance would only increase casualties without changing the outcome. But the Japanese command structure, bound by military tradition and cultural imperatives that forbade surrender, could not issue orders to cease fighting, so the battle continued for 18 more days, not because there was any operational purpose, not because Japanese forces had any prospect of success or relief, but because the alternative, surrender, was unthinkable. 18 days, 5,000 additional American casualties, perhaps 25,000 additional Japanese military deaths, unknown additional civilian casualties, all after the defending commander knew the outcome was inevitable. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson, operations officer for the 24th Corps, examined the casualty figures with a calculator and a growing sense of horror. From June 1st to June 18th, American forces suffered approximately 4,200 casualties, including roughly 900 killed. During the same period, based on prisoner interrogations and captured burial records, Japanese forces lost approximately 28,000 killed. I kept checking the math, Thompson later said, because I couldn't believe it. 25% of our total campaign casualties occurred after the battle was effectively over. Almost 10% of our killed in action died fighting an enemy that knew they were already defeated. We lost 900 men in 18 days defeating an army that had already lost, and General Buckner was number 901. The human dimension of this revelation emerged through dozens of individual encounters in the battle's final weeks. Private First Class Donald Martinez, a 19-year-old rifleman from Albuquerque, New Mexico, participated in an assault on a cave system on June 15th. We'd been told this was a battalion headquarters, he recalled. We expected major resistance. We spent 2 hours with flamethrowers and satchel charges getting into the cave. When we finally got inside, we found 23 Japanese soldiers. Only 6 were wounded. The rest were just starving. They hadn't eaten in a week. They had no ammunition left. They were just sitting there waiting to die because they couldn't surrender and they couldn't fight. We killed them all. We had to. But Christ, they were just sitting there. They'd already lost. They knew it. We knew it. And we had to kill them anyway because that's how this war worked. Similar encounters occurred across the entire southern battlefield during those final weeks. Sergeant William O'Connor, a squad leader in the 7th Infantry Division, described finding a Japanese aid station in a cave on June 13th containing 47 wounded men and 2 medics. They had no medical supplies at all, O'Connor testified. Men with infected wounds, amputations, belly wounds, just lying there rotting. The smell was indescribable. The medics weren't treating them because they had nothing to treat them with. They were just waiting with them while they died. When we came in, the medics bowed, just stood up and bowed like they were surrendering. We got them out, got them to our aid station. Both of them cried when our doctors started treating their wounded, cried because we had morphine and antibiotics and we were actually trying to save them. This was June 13th. We fought for 5 more days after that. The progressive revelations created a cascading realization among American officers who examined the evidence after the battle. First revelation: the Japanese command knew the battle was lost by early June. Second revelation: Japanese forces lacked the supplies to continue effective resistance after June 10th. Third revelation: Most Japanese units were isolated and couldn't communicate with headquarters or each other. Fourth revelation. Many of the defensive positions American forces assaulted in mid-June were held by troops who had no orders, no support, and no prospect of relief. Fifth revelation. The American systematic approach, so careful about minimizing friendly casualties, had continued grinding forward at the same methodical pace, even as enemy resistance was collapsing, resulting in final weak casualties that might have been avoided with faster exploitation once the breakthrough was achieved. This last revelation was the most painful for officers who understood operational doctrine. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hayes, a staff officer who had recommended accelerated operations in early June after intelligence reports indicated Japanese command and control was breaking down, found himself reviewing after-action reports with mounting frustration. "We had indicators by June 5th that their army was falling apart," Hayes said in a post-war interview. Radio intercepts showed confused commands, contradictory orders, communications breaking down. Air reconnaissance showed major movement in their rear areas, signs of repositioning or possibly retreat. Prisoner interrogations consistently reported supply shortages and loss of contact with higher headquarters. Multiple staff officers recommended we accelerate operations to exploit the collapse. General Buckner decided to maintain the systematic approach. He was concerned about casualties. He didn't want to take risks with his men's lives, so we kept the same methodical pace while the enemy army disintegrated in front of us, and men kept dying on both sides for another 2 weeks. The paradigm-shattering evidence came from Buckner's own operations journal, found among his personal effects after his death. The general had been receiving intelligence reports about Japanese supply failures and command breakdowns since late May. He had noted in his journal on June 3rd, "Intelligence indicates enemy nearing collapse. Staff recommends accelerated operations. However, systematic approach has worked thus far and minimized casualties. See no reason to change tactics when current approach is succeeding." On June 7th, more reports of enemy supply problems. Some staff pressure to increase operational tempo. Marines want to try amphibious envelopment again. Still seems risky. Will maintain current approach. On June 12th, intelligence now says enemy army may be incapable of coordinated defense. Frontline reports indicate decreasing resistance quality. Will consider acceleration if pattern continues. On June 16th, battle effectively won. Organized resistance ceased. Final mop-up operations to begin. What the journal revealed was a commander trapped by his own doctrine. Buckner's entire approach to warfare emphasized careful preparation, overwhelming force, and acceptance of slower progress to minimize casualties. This method had worked in the Aleutians. It had worked through the Okinawa campaign's first 2 months. But military doctrine required not just a way to advance steadily, but also a way to recognize when the situation had fundamentally changed, and faster exploitation was both possible and necessary. Buckner's journal showed he received the intelligence about Japanese collapse, but couldn't bring himself to change his approach because the systematic method felt safer, more controlled, less risky with soldiers' lives. He was a careful commander in a situation that called for aggressive exploitation. His caution, intended to save lives, may have cost lives during the battle's final 2 weeks. The irony multiplied when analysts examined Marine Corps proposals that Buckner had rejected. On June 4th, Major General Lemuel Shepard of the 6th Marine Division had proposed an amphibious landing behind Japanese lines to cut off retreating forces and potentially force a faster conclusion. Buckner had declined, citing concern about logistics, beach conditions, and the risk of forces being cut off if Japanese resistance proved stronger than expected. By June 8th, when intelligence reports made clear that Japanese forces were exhausted and disorganized, Marine commanders renewed the proposer, arguing that an aggressive envelopment could end the battle within days and save hundreds or thousands of casualties. Again, Buckner declined, noting in his journal, "Marines always want to be aggressive. Admirable spirit but consider risk. Will continue systematic approach." The battle continued for 10 more days. The amphibious landing was never attempted. Whether it would have succeeded remains unknowable. but multiple post-war analyses concluded it would likely have been unopposed, as Japanese forces in the proposed landing area were already abandoning positions and retreating south without any coherent defensive plan. Major Harold Kaufman, a 34-year-old aide to Buckner who was standing 20 feet away when the general was killed, experienced a psychological transformation that haunted him for the rest of his life. In the immediate aftermath of Buckner's death, Kaufman felt grief and anger at the random cruelty of the general being killed after the battle was won. But as he reviewed the intelligence reports and operations logs in the following weeks, as he spoke with Japanese prisoners and read captured documents, as he calculated the casualties suffered in June after the enemy army had ceased functioning as a coherent force, his grief transformed into something more complex and more disturbing. "I kept thinking about that shell," Kaufman said in 1952, giving testimony for the Army's official history of the campaign, "that random shell that killed General Buckner. It was so cruel, so unfair. He'd commanded the entire campaign, brought us to victory, and then was killed at the very end by random harassment fire. But then I started thinking about all the other deaths in those final weeks. The Marines who died taking that ridge on June 10th when the enemy there had no ammunition. The soldiers who died clearing caves on June 14th when the men inside were already starving and disorganized. The hundreds who died in those last few days when the battle was essentially over. Were those deaths any less random, any less unfair? They died because we were being careful, being methodical, following our doctrine, not taking risks. But the enemy wasn't capable of organized resistance anymore. We were fighting carefully against an enemy that had already ceased to exist as a functioning army. So maybe we were being careful in a situation where caution itself was costing lives." Kaufman's transformation reflected a broader realization among many American officers who studied the battle's final phase. The United States Army's doctrine, developed through decades of training and refined through years of war, emphasized careful preparation and systematic execution. This doctrine had produced victory after victory. It had brought American forces from North Africa to Sicily to Italy to France to Germany and Europe, from Guadalcanal to the Philippines to Okinawa in the Pacific. It had worked. But doctrine was meant to be a guide, not a straitjacket. Great commanders knew when to follow doctrine and when the situation demanded deviation. Buckner, trained as an instructor dedicated to teaching proper method, perhaps couldn't make that shift. His caution, his carefulness, his insistence on systematic execution, even when the situation had fundamentally changed, may have represented not wisdom, but inflexibility. The supporting evidence, mounted as post-battle investigations, continued. Colonel James Coolidge, Inspector General for 10th Army, conducted after-action interviews with battalion and company commanders throughout July and August. Consistently, frontline officers reported that enemy resistance in mid-June had lacked the intensity, coordination, and effectiveness of earlier phases. "By June 10th, we weren't fighting an army," said Captain Edward Morrison, commander of a rifle company in the 96th Division. "We were fighting individuals or small groups. No coordinated fires, no prepared positions, no counterattacks. Just men in caves who fought until we killed them because they wouldn't surrender. It wasn't combat in any real sense, it was extermination, and we kept doing it carefully, methodically, by the book, while men died on both sides for no operational reason." First Lieutenant Thomas Bradley, a platoon leader in the 1st Marine Division, described the June 14th assault on Hill 89, a position that cost his platoon 6 men killed and 14 wounded. "We spent 3 hours with preparatory fires," Bradley testified. "Artillery, mortars, airstrikes absolutely flattened the hill. Then we advanced expecting heavy resistance because that's what doctrine called for. We found 42 Japanese dead from the bombardment and 17 alive. Wounded, no weapons, no ammunition, no food, no medical supplies. They'd been there for days, maybe weeks, just waiting. We lost 6 dead and 14 wounded, taking a position that couldn't have resisted if we'd just walked up the hill. But we did it by the book. We prepared the objective properly. We advanced carefully. We minimized risk, and 6 of my men died doing it the safe way." The accumulated testimony created a portrait of systematic caution applied in a situation where the enemy had ceased to be dangerous in any conventional sense. By mid-June, Japanese forces were dangerous only because they wouldn't surrender, not because they could effectively resist. American systematic doctrine, designed for fighting a capable, organized enemy, continued to treat every position as potentially deadly, every advance as potentially opposed, every objective as potentially fortified. This careful approach made perfect sense when the enemy was capable of organized defense. It made much less sense when the enemy was scattered, disorganized, out of supplies, and incapable of coordinated action. But doctrine was doctrine, training was training, caution was caution, and the systematic approach ground forward while men died on both sides in a battle that had already been decided. The broader context revealed structural factors that made Buckner's approach almost inevitable. American military culture in 1945 emphasized casualty aversion. Commanders who suffered heavy casualties while achieving objectives faced criticism and relief. Commanders who advanced slowly, that kept casualties low, received praise. The public supported the war, but was increasingly casualty sensitive as victory approached. Families wanted their soldiers to come home alive. Politicians faced pressure about casualty figures. Theater commanders judged subordinate commanders partly by casualty efficiency ratios. In this environment, being careful always seemed like the right choice. Taking time to prepare positions, using maximum firepower before infantry advances, accepting slower progress in exchange for fewer casualties, all of this aligned with institutional incentives and cultural values. But military effectiveness required balancing casualty aversion against operational opportunity. Sometimes speed saved lives by preventing enemy reinforcement, resupply, or reorganization. Sometimes aggressive action exploited enemy weakness before they could recover. Sometimes the careful approach, by giving the enemy time to prepare or reorganize, actually increased total casualties over the campaign. Great commanders understood these dynamics and adjusted their approach as situations changed. Buckner, formed by decades of teaching systematic doctrine, perhaps couldn't make that adjustment. Or perhaps he could have chose not to, judging that the risks of acceleration outweighed potential benefits. The judgment call was his to make. History would judge whether he made it correctly. The comparative statistics were damning when analysts examined casualty patterns across the campaign. From April 1st to May 31st, 61 days, 10th Army suffered approximately 8,300 killed in action, about 136 per day. From June 1st to June 18th, 18 days, approximately 900 killed in action, about 50 per day. The daily casualty rate in June was actually lower than the earlier campaign average, suggesting that Buckner's careful approach was working. But intelligence estimates based on prisoner interrogations and captured documents indicated that Japanese combat effectiveness had declined by approximately 70 to 80% in early June compared to May levels. If American forces had accelerated operations after June 5th, when intelligence clearly indicated enemy collapse, analysts estimated the final phase could have been completed by June 10th, saving approximately 8 days of combat and perhaps 400 casualties. This was speculation, of course. War never provided controlled experiments. But the analysis suggested that excessive caution in mid-June, while appearing safe, may actually have cost lives by extending the battle unnecessarily. Lieutenant General Simon Buckner never faced these questions. He died believing his campaign had been conducted properly, that his systematic approach had achieved victory while minimizing casualties, that his decisions had been vindicated by success. His final words to Major Kaufman concerned administrative matters about the occupation phase. He died as a victorious commander, not as a man questioning his choices. The questions came later, asked by others, as they examined what he had known, when he had known it, and what decisions he had made with that knowledge. The psychological transformation among 10th Army staff officers accelerated after Buckner's death when they had to prepare the official campaign report. Major General Roy Geiger, who assumed command after Buckner's death, ordered a thorough analysis of operations for submission to Pacific Fleet Headquarters. The analysis team, led by Colonel Jonathan Pierce, had to reconcile official doctrine with operational reality, explaining why the campaign had taken 82 days when pre-invasion estimates suggested 60 days would suffice. Pierce's initial draft attributed the extended timeline to unexpectedly strong enemy resistance and difficult terrain, but as he reviewed intelligence reports and frontline accounts, this explanation seemed increasingly inadequate. Enemy resistance had been strong through May. By early June, resistance was disorganized and weakening, yet operations had continued at the same pace through mid-June. Pierce rewrote the analysis, noting systematic approach prioritized casualty minimization over operational tempo. General Geiger approved the language and told Pierce privately, "What you mean is, we were too careful. We won, but we took too long. Some men died in those extra days who might have lived if we'd moved faster. But you can't say that in an official report, so we'll say we prioritized casualty minimization, and people can interpret that however they want." The contrast between official narrative and private understanding became stark as officers prepared the after-action report. Publicly, the Okinawa campaign was described as a brilliant success, a model of amphibious operations and systematic warfare. Privately, many officers believed the final phase had been mishandled, that intelligence about enemy collapse had been available but not acted upon, that systematic caution had been applied beyond the point where it made operational sense. These contradictory assessments created cognitive dissonance that some officers never resolved. Captain Arthur Chen, the intelligence officer who had discovered the Japanese headquarters cave, kept a personal journal throughout the battle. His June 20th entry captured the psychological struggle. "We found their headquarters abandoned on June 15th. Documents showed they were finished. Knew they were finished, had been finished for days. We kept fighting for 3 more days after that. General Buckner was killed on day 82 of a battle that documents show was effectively over by day 75. How do I write the intelligence summary for this? Do I say we correctly assessed enemy strength decline and continued systematic operations until organized resistance ceased? Or do I say, we knew they were beaten but killed them anyway because doctrine said to be careful, and caution meant we kept grinding forward at the same pace regardless of actual enemy capability? The first version is what will go in the report. The second version is what happened. I don't know how to live with the difference." The final irony revealed itself fully only after the war ended. In August 1945, less than 2 months after Buckner's death, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The invasion of Japan, for which Okinawa was supposed to provide the staging area, never occurred. Operation Downfall was cancelled. All the careful preparation, all the systematic planning, all the casualties accepted to capture Okinawa so it could support the next operation became moot. The island that cost 12,520 American lives and over 100,000 Japanese military and civilian deaths was never used for its intended strategic purpose. Staff officers who had argued for faster exploitation in June, who had wanted to accelerate operations once enemy collapse was evident, found this particularly bitter. Major Thomas Hayes, who had recommended increased operational tempo in early June, wrote to his wife in September 1945, "We took 82 days to capture Okinawa because we were being careful, because we didn't want to take unnecessary casualties, because we wanted to preserve forces for the next operation. Men died in June who might have lived if we'd moved faster, but we accepted those deaths because we were thinking about August, about the invasion, about preserving combat power. Then the bomb made it dead irrelevant. The next operation never happened. We were careful in June for an August that never came, and General Buckner died watching the end of a battle that was fought to enable an invasion that never occurred. I don't know if that's ironic or tragic or just the way war works, but I can't stop thinking about it." The philosophical question that emerged from Okinawa haunted American military doctrine for decades. When does caution become timidity? When does systematic execution become inflexibility? When does casualty aversion become an excuse for missing operational opportunity? Buckner had followed his training. He had applied the doctrine he had taught at West Point for years. He had been careful with his soldiers' lives, and he had won. The island was captured. The objective was achieved. But in the final weeks, after enemy collapse was evident, had his caution actually increased casualties by extending the battle unnecessarily, or had he correctly judged that acceleration carried risks that outweighed potential benefits? The question had no definitive answer, only competing interpretations that said as much about the interpreter as about the events themselves. Today, visitors to the Frankfort Cemetery in Frankfort, Kentucky, can find the Buckner family plot, where Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. rests alongside his father, the Confederate general who surrendered to Grant. The son's grave marker notes his dates of service and his rank: Lieutenant General, United States Army. It mentions he commanded 10th Army at Okinawa. It does not mention he was the highest-ranking American killed by enemy action in the war. It does not mention the timing of his death or the circumstances. It is a simple grave marker for a career officer who died in combat. In 1954, 9 years after his death, Buckner was posthumously promoted to full general. 4 stars, the rank he had been recommended for before he was killed. The promotion recognized his career of service and his command of the Okinawa operation. In some sense, it was the Army's way of honoring a man who had done everything by the book and paid the ultimate price. In another sense, it raised questions about whether following the book was always the right answer, whether doctrine should always trump judgment, whether systematic execution should continue when the situation had fundamentally changed. The real memorial to Buckner, though, is not his grave or his posthumous promotion. It is the debate his final campaign generated within the American military about the relationship between doctrine and judgment, between caution and aggressiveness, between minimizing friendly casualties and exploiting enemy weakness. That debate continued through Korea, Vietnam, and every subsequent conflict. It continues today whenever commanders must decide whether to follow established procedures or deviate based on changing circumstances. The Okinawa campaign, and particularly its final weeks, became a case study in military professional education precisely because it presented these tensions so clearly. What Lieutenant General Simon Buckner could not have known, standing between those 2 coral boulders on June 18, 1945, watching the 8th Marines advance across the Mesado Valley, was that his death 47 seconds later would symbolize not just the random cruelty of war, but the deeper question about whether his systematic caution in the battle's final weeks had been wisdom or inflexibility. The shell that killed him was random, meaningless, one more piece of steel among millions fired during the campaign. But the timing, killing him after the battle was won, after organized resistance had ceased, while he watched mop-up operations against an enemy that knew they were already defeated, created an irony that history would long contemplate. The mathematics were simple. Buckner was the 12,520th American fatality of the Okinawa campaign, killed on day 82 of a battle that some evidence suggested could have been concluded by day 75 if operations had been accelerated once enemy collapse became evident. Those extra 7 days cost approximately 400 American casualties, though this figure remains disputed and speculative. What is not disputed is that Buckner died enforcing a systematic approach that emphasized caution over speed, that continued grinding forward at a measured pace even as intelligence indicated the enemy was no longer capable of organized resistance, that followed doctrine even when circumstances suggested doctrine might need adaptation. Whether this was admirable steadiness or tragic inflexibility remains a question that has no answer, only the judgment history makes and remakes with each generation that studies the campaign. In the end, Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. achieved what he had spent 57 years preparing for. He commanded a major campaign. He defeated the enemy. He captured the objective. He did it following the doctrine he believed in and had taught others. And he died in combat, the soldier's death, giving his life in service as his Confederate father had given his reputation in defeat. The cost of his victory, the casualties of his carefulness, the mathematics of his caution, these are questions for others to judge. He died believing he had commanded well. Whether he was right is something history will debate long after everyone who fought at Okinawa has joined him in the grave.